All right, this was the last slide, brothers and sisters, that I believe we looked at. And, again, just to kind of get our minds going on what we've been talking about the last couple weeks. This is our third class. We got one more, I think. Is it our third? Yeah, third class. We got one more after this. So just a reminder that the children of Israel, because of the diaspora and because of the fact that they were conquered by the Babylonians, but also began to spread out into the Greek world with Alexander the Great. I think we talked about last week that some of the Jewish soldiers joined up with Alexander and kind of got to see the world. And it kind of opened up their eyes to a lot of different things. And very similar, brothers and sisters, the way that the Middle East was opened up during the Crusades to the Europeans. The Europeans, through conquest, obviously, went into the Holy Land and took Jerusalem on the first crusade. But more importantly, there was this interchange between the Muslim Arabs that were living in that area and the Jewish people as well with the European knights. And so, cultural exchange happened. And the same thing is going to happen with the Jews. They're going to spread out outside of Jerusalem and outside of the land of Israel. They're going to look for economic prosperity, and they're also looking for different ways, for trade and things of that nature. So they're going to spread out. They're going to be living in all types of the big cities in the Mediterranean world, both in the Greek-controlled areas and also the Roman-controlled areas. And we looked at this, right? God sent Israel into exile among the nations only for the purpose of acquiring converts, okay? And so a lot of this stuff is taken from Isaiah, from the 49th chapter in Isaiah 60, a light to the Gentiles. And so a lot of the Jewish people, as they spread out because of the diaspora, the scattering of the Jewish people, brought their customs, brought their ideas, and brought their religious beliefs as well into these different cities. They were welcomed as long as they paid their taxes and stuff like that. But as we've seen in the past, there was some friction, wasn't there, with the Greek speakers and the Jewish speakers as well. But there were God-fearers. And let's just take a look at one of these in Acts the 13th chapter. And when we get into, probably next week, when we look at some of the journeys of Paul, he uses this phrase quite a bit. But in the 13th chapter, of the 13th chapter, verse 16. And on the Sabbath, we went out of the city by a riverside where prayer was wont to be made, and we sat down and spoke unto the women which resorted there. So there were women by the river who were what? Well, they were praying. And so there's some speculation here at Philippi that a synagogue, they didn't have enough people for the synagogue. And so a lot of times the Jews, to remember Jerusalem, would go down to a river and to pray there. It's interesting. A certain woman named Lydia, a seller of purple, was there, whose heart the Lord opened, that she attended unto the things which were spoken of Paul. And when she was baptized in her household, she besought us, saying, If ye have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come into my house and abide there. And she constrained us. And so here we have Paul kind of finding other believers, Jews that were there, but also Gentiles who were called God-fearers. In the what do we do? 13? Yeah, in 13, verse 16. Then Paul stood up, beckoning with his hand, said, Men of Israel, right? So that's one category. Men of Israel. And his second category, and you people that fear God, listen to me. Okay, and so there are other people outside of men of Israel. They were Gentiles, they were God-fearers, they were interested in Judaism. They were interested in this idea of a one God. They saw most likely the religious, the religious strength and the communal strength of a synagogue, and they wanted a piece of it. They're like, they were welcomed there. And so this is another thing too, brothers and sisters, that sometimes you don't think about. The Jews did not proselytize. They didn't go and preach the message of Judaism through the world. That isn't how, you don't have Jews knocking on the door, talking to you about the law of Moses. That isn't how they roll. But they did preach, I guess you could say, by the communities that they would set up in these different cities based upon the synagogue. And people would be, they're looking for something. They're in this pagan world. It's a jumble. There's a lot of confusion on religious things. And then you have this one group of people that just believe in one God. And they are committed, baby, right? You can imagine just kind of very, conservative Jews, how different they would be from the Romans. Their day was very different from a regular Roman day. And this had appeal to some of the Roman citizens, maybe to some of the slaves that were there as well. This sense of community. This is one of the things that unfortunately was lacking in the Roman world, particularly with the underclasses. They just were constantly working all the time, particularly slaves. You don't have you don't have physical control over your body. You're told to do this and you're told to do that. And so it was demoralizing a lot of times. And so something like a synagogue where people come together and to worship together and to support it was very important to a lot of people in the ancient world. And this is something that's going to, you have the, Judaism, but out of Judaism comes early age Christianity. And that as well was also very appealing to people as well, this idea of community, helping each other out. What does it say in Acts? That they pooled all of their resources together? They had all things common. Like that isn't something that you naturally found in the Roman world, right? This idea of kind of communal living together, sharing all of your things. Very different. All right? Questions, comments before we go on here? Very good. Quick map that I found interesting just to give us a scale of travel during this time, and this really fits very nicely, obviously, with Paul, because we know of 3 journeys that he took, right? Well, you maybe think like the 3 journeys of Paul, and we just kind of gloss over that sometimes. Like the 3 journeys of Paul, I think this map kind of tells us a little more information about what that entailed. This was not an easy thing to do, okay? If you find Italy for me, okay? Judy, you found Italy? Judy! Judy, where's Afghanistan on this picture? It's not on. That's a trick question. It's a trick question. All right, so we found Rome, that little red dot in the middle of the boot of Italy, okay? Anything that is blue, okay? Any city or village or area in the blue would take you, anywhere between 3 to 7 days to get to, depending on how far it was, okay? So, under a week travel in the blue areas. The green areas, well, it's going to be a little longer than a week. Could be a week and a half to 2 weeks. Yellow, you're pushing 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Anything in the red, you're looking at a month plus. When we're talking about travel, the combination of taking a ship or, walking, riding an animal, that type of thing. So, travel today, you can't jump on a plane and be out on the West Coast today in like 8 hours, right? Less than that, right? Probably 6 hours, right? Obviously was not the case. We didn't have jet power during this time. So anything in the red is going to be a major journey. But anything outside of the blue is going to take you at least 2 to 3 weeks to get to. And so Paul, in his travels, is going to be spending months and months. In fact, when you look at all of his 3 journeys, years on the road and what that entails. And we'll look at that probably next class, 2 Corinthians, the 11th chapter, where he kind of goes through all the trials that he went through to travel. All right, so let's get to the place where Saul where he grew up and got an education to a certain degree. We know that he is going to, at some point in time, most likely with his sister, is going to move to Jerusalem. How old Paul was when he moved to Jerusalem to become part of the religious school of Gamaliel, we're not told. But most likely it was when he was like, a teenager, okay? Because usually that's when you made a decision to kind of go to one of these schools, these religious schools, to be taught a really in-depth, like a deep dive. You're going to become what? A doctor of the law? Well, where do you go to be a doctor of the law? Well, you go to one of the schools that the Jews had set up specifically for, teaching of the law and the intricacies of the law. All right? But before we look at that, let's go back. Where was Paul born? We know that he was born in Tarshish. Tarshish was not like a backwater city at all. It was a main city. In fact, you could kind of compare it to one of the major cities of America, all right, a New York or like a Chicago or something along those lines, a Los Angeles, a big, big city. In the ancient world, 250,000 people, okay? Historians and archaeologists say that in Rome was probably 1 million people, somewhere around there, okay, at its height. And so this was not a small city. Think about in the ancient world, 250,000 people living in one area and what that entailed. It was bustling. You had all of these people, doing this, that, and the other thing. If you ever watch any travel shows or anything, I like watching Rick Steves, travel with the, on PBS. All right, settle down, nerd. Okay, I get it. You do a lot of PBS, do you? That's a shocker. When he travels around, he goes to these cities, particularly these, like European cities or Middle Eastern cities like Cairo. They did one on Cairo. And it's just bustle everywhere. You go down to the, there's no really big supermarkets or anything. You go down to the market and get everything. This is how they're doing it right now. And so I like watching these shows because it gives us a perspective into how the rest of the world lives. Right? We can be very isolated in a kind of a, one of the top areas of the world to live, New England, access to medical, education, all the things that we have access to. Okay? It's not true of the rest of the world, for the majority of the world. Okay? So anyways, one of the greatest cities of the Roman world. It was a center of trade of Asia Minor. You can see that it's located right on the coast, had a beautiful harbor. It was located on a river, so they would go up the river. So it was a city that was situated in a very nice area as well. Here's a very important thing for Tarshish. It was a free city. In other words, it could govern itself. It had its own council. Didn't have to worry about like the Greeks from another place getting involved in their politics. Rome couldn't even get involved in their own politics unless there was some type of revolt because it was in Roman territory. But they could run their business as they saw fit. And so this was something that the Greeks gave to the people of Tarshish, and the Romans continued that as well. Didn't have to pay any taxes, no duty taxes, so people are going to flood to Tarshish because this was where money was being made, okay? There was a lot of opportunity to become successful. Things that drive us today, right? People move to different areas of the country or areas of the world for opportunity. Same was true in the ancient world. Ooh, Tarshish is a free city? Great, I don't have to pay taxes. I can start my business with the trading? Fantastic, okay? And this is what a lot of people do. Tremendous amount of wealth here. In fact, they were known for, the people of Tarshish and the leaders of Tarshish were known for their massive investment into infrastructure. There were great roads. There were public fountains. There was, an amphitheater for theater and stuff like that, okay? I believe they had a small, like, Coliseum type of structure for games and things of that nature. But it was a nice city. It was really nice. They put they reinvested a lot of the money that they got from trade, which was considerable, back into the infrastructure of the city itself, beautification projects, that type of thing. There are mountains located. The Taurus Mountains are located in this area. And there are a lot of minerals and lumber in and around the mountains. And so considerable amount of wealth is going to be taken out of this. This was interesting. There used to be huge herds of black goats that used to graze in and around Tarshish. And they would use the hair or the wool. Do goats have wool? What was it called? Goat hair? Goat wool? Goat hair, probably, right? goat hair. They would use that to make cloaks and kind of heavy-duty kind of outside jackets, things of that nature. So again, you have minerals, you have the lumber, you have trade of all types of goods. You have, the whole industry of processing goat hair, right? Think about the industry of all of these things, okay? It was a bustling city. Now, this is also interesting. It was a university town. There were all kinds of different schools that were going. You could get a really great education at in the city. And there are some historians that kind of call Tarshish the Ivy League of the ancient world, because you had all these kind of different types of early day universities or schools that taught the wealthy and their children. They got an education. They got a really good education. You guys may be familiar with the the Greek philosophy of being a Stoic, right? Not getting too high, too low, just kind of going with the flow. Focus on the renewal of oneself, strengthening your own self. This idea of discipline, disciplining yourself, keeping yourself under subjection. Those are things. That's a philosophy that Paul is going to kind of weave into his letters, isn't he? Right? I bring my body into subjection, he says a few times. He compares himself to a runner or to a boxer, and this is kind of the Stoics thought like this as well. Paul knew classical Greek, and we know this from his writings. He had really good Greek. He knew all, and so he had really good Greek. He knew all, and he could speak fluently in Conine Greek, which was kind of the day-to-day language in the Greek world. You had two main languages in this area. Number one was Greek, number two was Aramaic, and the third would be Latin. Okay? Most of the people in the Middle East, particularly around Syria and Israel, that area, all spoke Aramaic, okay? That doesn't mean Hebrew wasn't spoken, but Hebrew was spoken only for a religious language, kind of like Latin is with the Roman Catholic Church, right? People aren't conversing in Latin, but when you go to a Catholic Mass, you're going to hear a lot of Latin. And so the same was true in the ancient world. Hebrew was the language of religion. It was the language of God, really. That's how some of the Jews looked at it. And because of that reason, it was almost lost. But the Jews understood that if you lose your language and culture, you lose your people. And so this was one of the reasons why the Jews had an emphasis on education. And they still do today. They put a heavy emphasis on education. And this comes from the reading of the law, right? You had to read the law. You had to know how to write, right? And so the law of Moses is tied up into reading and writing. And so this is why, to truly understand the Word of God, you needed to read it and to write it as well. And so schools were set up for the very purpose of keeping the Hebrew language alive, keeping the religious rituals alive as well, keeping the culture of the Jewish people alive. And this is not only happening in Jerusalem, it's happening in Jerusalem on a large scale, because this is kind of the religious center of the Jewish world, Jerusalem. They went there 4 times a year, particularly during Passover as well. And so Paul was a highly educated Jewish young man. He had his whole life in front of him. He could have been he most likely came from like a upper middle class family. We're not really told, what Paul's dad did. Right, but we know that he worked with leather, right? He was a tent maker, and tents were made primarily from leather, which wasn't a great job, by the way, in the ancient world, to get to take animal skins, the whole process by which, the scraping of kind of animal, fat and stuff off of the skin. Urine was used as well to kind of break down the skin. It's a whole process. The tanners, right? The tanner area of the ancient world, very smelly place. You have all this kind of rotting animal, byproduct. You have urine being used as well to break down the skin. So it wasn't a great place. So Paul would have been very familiar. Saul would have been very familiar with this process. I don't think he was involved in the process kind of making the leather, but he got the kind of the final product of the manufactured leather, and then he made tents from it. I'm guessing, but maybe he was involved in it. I don't know. He was most likely some type of, like a leather trader or something like that, or a tent trader, something along those lines. Now, tents were very important. It was actually pretty lucrative, especially if you got a contract for the Roman army. All right, because all those guys needed tents, didn't they? Small tents, big tents, that type of thing. So, all right. The biggest thing with Paul, brothers and sisters, was he was a Roman citizen. You want to talk about privilege in the ancient world, he was a privileged guy. He could do what he wanted for the most part, okay? He was a voting member. If there was any type of voting membership into something, he could vote. He could, if he wanted to, he could be part of the council. He could run for office, political office. There were special tax things as well that were designated for citizens. He could go to law, right? If he didn't like a ruling against him, he could appeal it. He couldn't just be taken off the street and beaten, right? That's going to happen to him, right? And he's going to get into this conversation, this great conversation with the centurion. He goes, I'm a Roman citizen, right? You beat me in front of everybody. You're going to apologize to me as well in front of everybody. So we'll look at that. All right, now this is from, I should have put his name up here, I didn't, historian. This is what he says now about a Greek-Roman education that Paul would have been part of. There's two types of things here, brothers and sisters. There's a Greek and Roman secular education, right, that Paul is going to get. He's also going to get a very strong religious education as well in the school of Gamaliel. Okay, so Paul obviously is going to show signs of like an aptitude for the things of the law, and it comes out in his writings, like some of the stuff, the connections that he makes. When you read it, you're like, oh wow, this guy's he's got his mind around it. You know what I'm saying? Obviously being directed by the Holy Spirit, but still, God uses people's intellect to further the gospel message. He's going to use Paul as well, the secular education that he got. Anyways, Greco-Roman education was liberal in its scope. Okay, in other words, they're going to learn about a lot of different things. It's not just kind of a narrow education. Slaves supervised boys in their early years by giving them their first lessons, and then leading them to and from private schools until they graduated into adulthood with a great deal of ceremony. As young men, they could attend universities at Athens, Rhodes, Tarshish, Alexandria, and other places to study philosophy, rhetoric, law, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, geography, and botany. Right? And so, again, a liberal education. All right, so, Saul's a smart guy. Right? He's not a dummy. He's a smart guy. He had a great education. Okay? And so, in a lot of ways, brothers and sisters, Paul has 2 feet in both camps. He knows all about the Greek and Roman world. He knows how everything works in the Greek and Roman world. The biggest thing, he can speak the language. He can speak Greek fluently. He can write classical Greek fantastic. Okay? It's interesting, if you look at the Greek from, the book of Revelations and Paul's Greek is the best. Like, he really does a great, the Greek. If you look at the Revelations, the Greek that's used in Revelations for whatever reason, it's not so great. Paul's Greek is better than, say, John's Greek, which is interesting to me, because it's not like God, they're moved by the Holy Spirit, inspired by the Holy Spirit. But God is using their abilities, right? He's like, hey, not everybody's going to have perfect penmanship. Your Greek is going to be better than my Greek. Your Spanish is going to be better than my Spanish, right? But God is still using people regardless of whether or not their Greek is classical, right? It isn't a competition. It's like, get the message out there, right? All right. What do we got for time? You know what? We're going to start with this next week. We'll start with this this slide for next week, the zealous hammer of God, right? This is Paul. We're going to get an insight into Paul's kind of, what his worldview, his thinking, that type of thing.